Um, Thank you so much for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elvira Yanganiose. I'm the curator of Basilea, a creative time project commissioned by Art Basel to offer today and this entire week, well, we in fact have been here since May the 23rd, a conversation around the awareness of being a citizen in an urban space and what that could mean. And it's exciting for me to sit in one of in our second conversation, but part of the exchange that we're having not only with artists Lara Almarcegui, Recetas Urbanas, and Isabel Luis that are part of Basilea, but also with experts and members of the intellectual community that have decided to join us to reflect, to observe and expand some of the ideas that are embedded in this particular case in Almarcegui's work. It is a pleasure for me to introduce this session on Wastelands and Mineral Rights, in which we have Anna Minton, Emily Scott, Manuel Herz, and it's going to be moderated by Lara herself. And I'm going to let her introduce the talk, and the speakers, you have information on who they are, what they do, on our website, creativetime.org. Just to say that it's extremely exciting to have the chance to have you here. If you want, we're going to have an extended conversation with Anna Minton. Anna, sorry, look at me. I don't know what's happening with me this trip, and all the names are making a real mess. It's probably because I'm traveling through time and space. Anna, excuse me, apologies. So Anna Minton is going to be with us later on. So if you want to join us for extending this conversation at 3, please let us know at the end of this talk, and we'll take it from there. But without further ado, I want to ask you in joining me in welcoming Anna, Emily, Emmanuel with Lara. Thank you.
Well, hello. Thanks everyone for coming here. Today I want to address the question of land, or let's say grounds. I think land is very important to understand how the city is constructed, how the city is developed, the question on what forces are pushing certain areas to be constructed in a certain way, the questions on how things are built as they are, why certain things are not built, and mainly the question on who owns land, who is the owner of land, and for whom the city is built. Another second question, a little bit more forgotten even than land and grounds, that I want to address is the question on what lies below the land, what lies below the ground, and whom owns it. This is the question on mineral rights and the ownership of the resources that lay below the city and the grounds, and what happened with them. I spent many years of my work looking at construction and development, standing against architectural design, construction, and standing against developers. And lately I realized that actually what architects do is to land in terms of destruction is really very small compared with what mining companies does. So actually mining, the extraction, not of these little things for the telephone that you see so often in the newspaper, but just the extraction of aggregates for the production of construction materials, gravel, sand, stones for concrete is enormous. It's an enormous destruction, and I think it's a very urgent and very forgotten question I would like to discuss today. So our speakers, Anna Minton, I really admire the way, we have one of her books, I quite admire the way she is going into a lot of details about who owns the ground, how ground gets privatized in her book, Ground Control, and then more lately how buildings are demolished and people are evicted, and how areas are being used as investment for developers. Manuel, an architect from Basel, probably one of the first persons I meet ever in Basel. We had a very enlightening conversation where he explained me in front of a map how everything that is dirty and polluting and extracting and nasty in Basel happened outside Basel, outside the frontier in France and Germany. And this vision, which for you people in Basel might be very evident, it was very shocking and enlightening. And well, we had quite an exchange on our positions on wastelands, construction, architecture. Emily is very close to me in her vision. She's a researcher, a scholar, but she's part of a group of artists, World of Matter, looking at resources in a worldwide point of view. And she has quite a view for the underneath, the question of resources, and a view to the mineral rights and what lays below, and we really share this interest. So, maybe, do you feel like?
Sure, I feel like. First, thanks so much to Lara and Elvira and the whole Creative Time team for hosting this conversation and inviting us here. It's a wonderful place to speak and part of a really stimulating conversation series. I've been going to a lot of the talks in the last few days. It's been a high point for me at Art Basel, in fact. As Laura said, we've known each other a couple of years, and it's been very generative and inspiring for me to both know your work better over the last couple of years and you personally, and to sort of start having conversations I hope we have for a long time to come. Lara, when she invited us, she said that we should each speak 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning, and that we might talk about our own work. Although, of course, I think we also should reserve plenty of time to talk about Lara's work, which is probably why most of you are here. But I will say a few things up front about how my own work for a long time now has connected to the topic of the wasteland and more recently to mineral rights. My dissertation, I studied contemporary art history at UCLA, and my dissertation was called Wasteland. And I was looking at land-based practices by artists in the 1960s in the United States. And I started with an interest in why was it that a handful of kind of vanguard artists at that period, who were like sort of a batch of artists who were first, at least in the Western context, leaving the gallery museum space and heading outdoors to the field and engaging in actual outdoor sites. Why was it that at least the artists I perceived as being rather critical had an attraction to these very degraded sites, post-industrial sites, polluted sites, desert, dry lake beds in the desert that at that point in the public imagination were very directly associated with atomic testing. So these places that were dumping grounds, quarries, these types of kind of liminal or wasted spaces, you could say. And what were the reasons for that? One of the reasons, I think, was that many of these artists were interested in resisting or pushing against romantic ideals of nature and scenic approaches to nature. And so one of my conclusions was that, you know, these artists, which include many people, Robert Smithson being probably the best known or the most obvious protagonist in this crew, but there were others as well, and women artists too. To go to nature or landscape not as an escape, but to go to landscape as a way to confront the contemporary and kind of the paradoxes and complexities of the present. So landscape then becomes a marker of the present rather than kind of a space to escape the present. And I do think there's a lot of interesting resonance between Lara's work and Robert Smithson's in particular, which I'm sure many art historians point to this immediately. More recently, my work, sort of since the dissertation, has really pretty squarely focused on contemporary art practices that deal with space and environment, and more specifically spatial politics and environmental politics. Often this kind of work is associated with social practice or socially engaged art, or more specifically what Jane Rendell has called critical spatial practices. And I think differently from the 1960s, I think artists today still are very attracted, and architects too, to kind of wastelands, or what has been called since the 90s, thanks to Solo Morales, the terrain vague. There remains a kind of attraction to these sites, but for somewhat different reasons. And I think part of that is that a lot of artists who are taking up the politics of space today, these days, their work is really focused on the rampant privatization and financialization of space and also of Earth in recent decades, tied to kind of late capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. And so in this moment, the terrain vague, or the wasteland, maybe holds a slightly different, there's a different layer now. And just a couple of thoughts about the wasteland today. I think that it represents, in a way, a rupture in the fabric of the kind of hyper-designed urban space. It's sort of when you encounter, for instance, an empty lot that's overgrown with weeds, or that provides a kind of space of green in the midst of a, kind of concrete asphalt landscape, there's some kind of rupture that occurs. These spaces that you refer to as wastelands, and I think that's a term we can discuss further, but often represent a kind of a moment when a space is not in circulation. It's a bit out of time, or it's a period that's sort of a respite from market circulation, so it's either post-design or pre-design. Certainly it could be a site of financial speculation, but I think artists are attracted to these sites because it also could be a site of potential kind of resistance that would symbolize how we might imagine urban space otherwise. So for imagination or kind of experimentation, these can be really interesting sites. In my own work as a site-specific artist, I have worked on public space, not in the collective World of Matter so much as a different collective called the LA Urban Rangers, and I won't say much about it except to say that we did a program on empty lots in LA, one of our first projects, where we built a campfire in an empty lot near downtown LA and just gathered people together to kind of explore this particular empty lot, which was very briefly empty, and to talk about the kind of meaning of empty lots in the context of that city at that moment. Maybe if I have time to say a couple of words about this piece, or should I save it and move on? We'll come back later. 2 minutes. Okay. So, and we can talk more about the financialization of the underground and mineral rights, I hope too, which is a part of my interest in her work. So, 2 quick observations, maybe obvious, about this gravel pit, or this, gravel pile that you have assembled here. I was so pleased. This morning I woke up and the first thing I thought of is I remembered this great quote from the artist Matthew Coolidge, who founded the Center for Land Use Interpretation in LA. For every pit there is a pile. No, for every pile there is a pit. So 2 things that I think this gesture does. I think one is that it automatically, when taken in consideration with this guide, it suggests that geography is relational. So this comes from somewhere, this material, and it forces us to think about the relationship between this pile and the pits that are around Zurich at these gravel piles, or around Basel, these gravel pits, these quarries. And then the second thing would be just the way that, again, it's sort of a rupture in the fabric of the city, and particularly, I think, seeing that geologic material, this kind of base primary material up against this shiny skyscraper and the starchitecture behind me is a very powerful way to kind of shift us to think about a very different register about how all buildings, all architecture, all urban spaces are built out of stuff. And this stuff has histories and it has geographies to it, and so it helps to kind of insert this other register into a very kind of hyper-human and hyper-designed space.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. That was really fascinating and links with so many themes that I think about in my work as well. So thank you very much to Lara for inviting me. It's really nice to be here with these really interesting thinkers. So just to tell you very briefly a little bit about me. My background is in journalism. 25 years ago I started as a journalist, and I've kind of found myself here, unexpectedly in some ways. I got fed up with journalism, partly because of the sort of pressures to write certain things in certain ways, the sort of pressures on time, and the impossibility of doing proper, real, meaningful work. So I moved into more in-depth writing about issues that really sort of I found of interest. And I wrote a report about gated communities and ghettos, and then I wrote a report about the privatisation of public space. I sort of fell into this area, and that's actually when I first met Lara. I think that was in 2005, so really quite a long time ago. And out of that came my first book, Ground Control, which very much looked at the privatisation of public space, the segregation of the city, who owns the city, and Ground Control's subtitle is Fear and Happiness in the 21st Century City. So the impact that actually has on our emotional and internal lives. And I think the link between the themes that Lara's really interested in and the themes I'm really interested in is that, you know, I'm talking a lot about the privatisation and financialisation of space. And when I look to solutions, and towards the end of Ground Control in the final chapter, I looked at solutions, and it's all about wastelands, and it's all about free space and space that operates outside of the market. And so it was really interesting to hear you, Emily, talk about the Turan Vag and, you know, what all of these spaces bring. But also it reminded me of the internal emotional themes that I was also concerned with, about the way individuals respond to those places, and how actually those places are a means for young people in particular to experiment in areas which aren't controlled and very rigid. And actually this is Kevin Lynch, who, you know, obviously I'm sure you know, he said, you know, these spaces are very often a way for young people to achieve mastery and to experiment. And actually what the privatisation of city space has done, particularly in the UK, where it's much more of a phenomenon than it is in continental Europe, but also very much in the US, is that it's created these huge, sterile, highly controlled spaces which are above all retail, consumer environments. They are homogenized places where there's just no room for that kind of experimentation, and that has a real impact on our ability to handle risk and on our fear of the outside world and how to cope with risk in the outside world. So just to move on to the work I've done more recently, that's taken on the work I've done about the privatisation and financialisation of city space to look at the housing crisis in the UK and London in particular, but in the context of the global housing crisis, which is affecting a great many cities in North America, Europe, around the world. And what we've seen happen, for any of you who know London, is the extreme financialisation of land and property in London. I mean, really, really extreme, where, you know, house prices in London have risen by 500% in the last 5 years, at the same time as the profits of the main property developers have also risen by 500%. Rents are extortionate. The majority of the population who rent privately pay more than 50% of their income in rent. Actually, according to research in this area, if you pay more than 30% of your income in rent, that will lead to mental health problems. So again, you know, I'm always very interested in how, you know, this affects us and our mental health and our sort of inner emotional states. But again, it sort of seems to link back into Lara's work and into what you were just talking about. Geography is relational, and actually we were discussing last night one of the aspects of this extreme wealth which has flooded into London since the financial crisis. That's why I've called the book Big Capital. One of the aspects of this is that in the super expensive parts of London, the sort of so-called alpha territories, you know, places like Kensington and Chelsea, St John's Wood, that they're called sort of super prime hotspots, or the golden postcodes by estate agents. one of the sort of signifiers of these places are what's called iceberg basements. I don't know if any of you have heard of the iceberg basements. And they're called iceberg basements because you'll just see a sort of, probably a little structure, like a sort of the top of an iceberg, outside a sort of beautiful, expensive Georgian home. But underneath, there is like perhaps a 2 or 3 story basement being excavated, and apparently there are now almost 5,000 of these, according to a new piece of research, which has been covered quite a bit in The Guardian. Swimming pools, home cinemas, even an artificial beach in one of these places. And they are all over these extremely expensive parts of London. But the link, to come back to this, is that apparently the amount of basement excavation that has taken place is equivalent to 50 shards. So Shard being the tallest building in London at present. So just imagine on the London skyline, 50 shards. Now that would have caused an outcry, total outrage. But this is invisible. And so, I mean, it is very controversial because actually foundations have destabilised huge neighbourhood disputes. It's not popular, but not in the same way, I don't think, as if it was on the skyline. So it's like, the material is displaced, but actually we don't see it. So I thought this was a very sort of telling example, just as with your quarries. And, I think the sort of one of the main points you're trying to make is you're trying to say, this material has been displaced, here it is. But, all the material which is being displaced underground for this extreme financialization, actually we're not seeing it. I wonder where it's going. Anyway, so there's lots more I could talk about in terms of capital in London, the property economy, why we're in this state, why we're driven by the property economy. But I think I've sort of laid out the link between, our work. So I'll probably leave it there.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Lara, for inviting me here for this fascinating panel, and thank you, Emily and Anna, for your contributions. It'll be hard to kind of match them. I'll speak from a vantage point of a practitioner. I'm an architect. I'm one of these who makes these, I love this quote, who makes these piles and produces a whole lot of shit and pits and stuff while doing that. So allow me, even though when we got to know each other, Lara, we spoke about Basel, allow me to speak maybe about one and a half projects that are not cited here. We can bring Basel back into the conversation a little bit later on. Because the two terms that feature so prominently in this title of this talk, mineral rights and wasteland, relate very much to a specific work that I've been doing with refugees for the last 10-12 years in the Western Sahara. The Western Sahara is the kind of a former Spanish colony on the western edge of the African continent, colonized until 1975, when on Franco's deathbed he made a gentleman's agreement for Morocco and Mauritania to take over the country when the last Spanish soldier had left the Western Sahara. And one of the motivations for especially Morocco to invade was exactly minerals, was exactly the presence of phosphate. It's one of the phosphate-richest regions on this planet. It's exactly these kinds of, well, this is not phosphate, but this kind of digging stuff on the ground that has, it might look like just dirty stuff, but it's incredibly valuable and motivates the occupation of a whole country. In this case, the Western Sahara, and the original local population had to flee into Algeria and has been living in refugee camps for the last 43 years. And without kind of misquoting Giorgio Agamben, we can of course kind of see these camps or these camps are often seen as kind of quasi-wastelands that are just there for waiting, that are very desperate, that have nothing in terms of resources. But the amazing thing that the refugees did, the Sahrawis, was to turn this wasteland not into flourishing land, but to turn it into a political project. To use the borrowed land that they are living in Algeria to kind of to experiment with new social forms and political forms of self-representation. And this is really brilliant. And they built the refugee camps themselves without exterior help. And they are also there because, and that's another kind of stuff underneath the ground, because there's a bubble of water, even though it's the most inhospitable region on this planet, 50, 55 degrees in the summer. There's a bubble of water that keeps them alive, basically. But they developed a kind of a political, quasi-utopian system of self-representation that kind of prepares them for the moment that their return could be possible, return to the Western Sahara. And I've documented this and analyzed this with the refugees, the kind of settlements and the political structure. And then we did a national pavilion of the Western Sahara at the Venice Biennale 2 years ago, where we gave a kind of a national presence, and we used this so iconic institution of the National Pavilion that is so iconic for Venice, or for the Venice Biennale, as a kind of political agency, as a where architecture becomes not only representational, or where these pavilions not only become representational, but where they kind of demand a political status for a nation that doesn't have access to its own territory. And stepping out a little bit, maybe that's how I like to see my architectural practice. Of course I build buildings, but maybe to understand the practice of architecture also as a form of research, where not, of course you need to kind of learn stuff to build a building, but also where the implementation of the building itself triggers reactions, triggers a kind of a momentum, exposes things and really kind of demands a reaction that you can only find out through this kind of architectural practice. So while doing a national pavilion of a nation that is not recognized in Venice, what kind of conflict did the foreign minister of Italy called Alejandro Avena and said that this has to be taken down, and so on. What do we do with how do we represent this? And we were weaving carpets. They were shown at the MoMA. How do we turn the MoMA into a kind of a tool of also projecting this kind of call for nationhood? So this question of, and I see it somehow also in your work, of how this artistic or architectural practice can be a form of research into something that you can only find out through actually doing it. And maybe if I have time for a little anecdote, do I?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Super. Where this maybe also comes to the foreground, I was invited exactly a year ago to participate in a competition for a hospital in eastern Senegal, in Tambacounda. And it was, we asked you to participate in this competition. It's, you won't earn any money with it, but it's very honorable, and it's a hospital, and blah, blah. And I responded with saying, like, this is fantastic, it's a topic I love, it's a region that I've traveled to many times, I'm very invested in this, I'm very fascinated, and it's very honorable, but I will decline, because I think it's not good that 10 architects, I was one of 10, in Basel, in New York, in London, in Berlin, and so on, are inventing solutions for a region that they've never been to, a client that they don't know, for doctors that they have never met, for patients that they've never spoken to. And I think the competitive format is not the right form. It needs to be a collaborative format, and only then we can develop a good response. It has to come through research. And the foundation that had invited me was so impressed with my response that they cancelled the competition and gave me the project, which was of course very, very nice. And then I went there for 2 weeks and did a kind of a research before.
Why do you do I don't know, an tutorial on pillars in a marshy land if you can just say no to it, you know, just, so you are my hero in that. Totally, it's wonderful, amazing. And then, so this brings me with another question I had for Emily, which was the question of activism, maybe more related with art. How much can we really, how much artists can produce change really in land and land politics, if we can, which is not.
I'm not sure if that's an unanswerable question, but I tend to be a bit of, I can both be extremely pessimistic about this kind of moment we live in, certainly, but also optimistic about the power of art to defamiliarize or make things strange or sensitize us in new ways to how we might think about space or become aware of the degree to which space is controlled. And to, I mean, it's kind of a cliche, but to kind of make visible or attune us to things which are otherwise invisible. So a lot of the work that I am most excited about and most invested in writing about or participating in is very oriented towards social justice and environmental justice. So in that sense, there's a very strong link to activism and to a kind of fundamental belief in the power of art or the aesthetic representation itself to kind of create change. But I heard a really good panel, I'm not going to remember who said it, but maybe it was Lara, the former director of the Queen's Museum. I won't pronounce her last name, Reykjavik. Something about how, I'm not sure it was her, about how artists are very nuanced and complex thinkers. And so they often can help at least evoke the complexity of a situation. So to this topic of kind of making visible, you know, often like your wasteland guides draw our attention to places that are out of view. So you redirect our gaze to places that were previously kind of either invisible, often actually invisible, because they're probably also sometimes highly secured, so you couldn't even go to them if you wanted to. But they're kind of off of our radar. So we live in the city, but we're not aware of the places that the city is built out of. That links also to the underground. The subterranean is a space that's like sort of literally out of view. And I'm going to kind of now move towards Anna with a question, which isn't so much about activism, but I was just thinking when you spoke about these iceberg basins, about the correlation to the phenomenon in the US of fracking as a technology of extreme extraction, which is now, so it's a kind of very dispersed form of extraction that also becomes integrated into residential spaces. So often you would have a fracking pad and a kind of well that's like in someone's front or backyard, and a corporation would own leasing rights to kind of the space underneath a house. So that would be an interesting project, I think, to kind of look at the links between these kind of extreme forms of excavation and extraction, which both, I think, are expressions of the same logic of extreme extraction.
Yeah, very good point, and we are well aware of fracking. Fracking has come to the UK, and it's a source of huge contention. There are various sites which have been designated for fracking. In fact, my partner's parents are massively involved in an anti-fracking campaign in North Yorkshire. You know, they're quite elderly, but they're part of the sort of, you know, we will be locked on type activists. But I think there is a really, really important link, not just the sort of subterranean sort of destabilizing of the underground, which, you know, both are, you know, severely damaging to what lies beneath, but it's actually the democratic process, because fracking is hugely unpopular. You know, local councils have basically said, we don't want fracking here, and if the local council said we're not giving planning permission, you know, that's the democratic process. But essentially the planning system has been redesigned over the last few years to remove those democratic levers, and fracking is effectively being imposed on certain areas. So there's a link between the total lack of democracy that fracking is imposing and the lack of democracy over many of the developments that I cover in big capital, which are being imposed on communities, and which, because I'm very aware of the fracking issue, I've discussed actually quite a lot, so you're completely right to point that out. I mean, one issue I really wanted to pick up on also was with regard to, Manuel, what you were saying about displacement, and I also want to pick up on the refusal issue. But displacement, you know, clearly in your work and in your work is such a huge issue with regard to communities being displaced over, you know, access to mineral rights. And displacement has been such an enormous issue in London, because what we've started to see over the last 10 years is the demolition of actually hundreds of housing estates of public housing, to be replaced by these luxury apartment developments, with communities being displaced as a result. And we have got to this stage where a lot of architects, you know, have no wish to be part of this, but, you know, they need jobs, they need to feed their families, all sorts of things like that. And similarly, artists who are constantly co-opted by big developers to provide, you know, nice projects, kind of art washing type projects to give the sort of patina of hipsterness and coolness. You know, what do you do? Well, I think exactly, you're completely right, Lara. You just refuse, and you've just shown, you know, that can actually reap dividends. So great, you know, it's really nice to have some positive aspect to this discussion.
Lara, do you want to talk to us about your mineral rights work, your recent work?
Yeah, thank you. I cannot wait to tell you about it. It's a project that I am really very excited about, because it was very difficult to realize it, but somehow in the art world there's not a big attention for it, and Emily is very interested in it, so something that really joins me with her. Mineral rights, you know what mineral rights are by now. It means that you can buy a piece of land, you can buy a building, but you cannot buy the underneath the building, the resources. They belong to the government, our governments, our states, in Europe at least. But our governments are selling the mineral rights to mining companies. That means that you might live in a city, a flat or a farm, and a company owns below you. For example, Rotterdam is owned by Shell, and there are different companies owning below Basel for salt and below Berlin. Depends which neighborhood you live in Berlin. You might have a company owning below your flat or not. That depends on the street and the area. Based on that, what I did, my interest to fight against architecture and construction, very fascinated by iron as a construction material, I acquired the mineral rights of an iron deposit in Norway. So I got a square kilometer, so 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer surface of mineral rights. That means I don't own the land, I own the resources, the iron below the land. And the mineral rights are till the middle of the earth. So it's really very, very deep. And they are exclusive, so no one can have them. Shell cannot have them, ArcelorMittal cannot have them. You cannot make a building with my iron, because I protect them. That's the project is very invisible, but it is, well, it is there. The iron is really there near Oslo. It's blocked, it's protected. And yeah, that's where I am heading for at this moment.
So a project like that's interesting for a few reasons, I think. One is it does link to activism pretty strongly, in the sense that there are activists now that are pooling together kind of resources to, well, they're pulling together financial resources to kind of keep oil in the ground, let's say, to prevent kind of extraction in a location. So that gesture of creating a hole in the market, withholding something from the market. I think that gesture is very central to what you're doing, which is really interesting. So that's a form of resistance. So you protect that material for an amount of time. But of course, the larger point of the project is not straightforward activism about this particular bit of iron, but to draw our attention to the much broader kind of situation of the kind of ground beneath our very feet being sold off to kind of mining companies and other industries and corporations. And I think it's also an interesting project in terms of, in art historical terms, in terms of institutional critique. But the institution you're taking on, I mean, it's sort of a lot of different institutions, but it's an intervention into a kind of system that draws our attention to the power that that system is kind of exerting. So.
Maybe it's also a good point to bring in your installation here and its relevance actually to the city and how super site specific it is, which is really why I like it so much. The first time that we did meet, we were speaking about these gravel pits and what is maybe not known to everybody, but gravel is one of the economies of the city of Basel, next to not only art, but also, of course, the farmer or the biochemical industry. And because of the Rhine, we have a lot of gravel and we excavate it. And because of the limitation of the canton, it's the city itself, and the canton is just 30 square kilometers. This is a very contested, of course, activity because it modulates the ground, it shifts the ground, it reshapes the ground, and it has a huge impact on architecture, urbanism, recreation, and so on, which I think is very interesting for Switzerland and the mentality, if I'm allowed to, as a non-Swiss, to speak about Swiss mentality, because somehow I think like one of the highest values in the Swiss mentality is stability. Like everything should be stable. Transformation is generally very skeptical or seen very skeptical. And what, of course, it shows is that some of the major parts of the Basel economy is based on exactly the opposite, on slow transformation or sometimes quick transformation on the most fundamental thing that we have, which is the ground. Then we see how once it gets revitalized, once these pits are closed, once they get transformed into park, it's this kind of cloaking of stability, or this kind of construction of stability, which is very artificial, but it looks supernatural and romantic almost. And this is, I think, what you are indicating and hinting at with your installation, which is really kind of touches the wound or this inner psyche of Switzerland, and especially of Basel, which is quite brilliant.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I just came with several anecdotes of things we found in the research, like a neighbor of a huge gravel pit in France, in Saint Louis, mentioning that this kind of idea that all Basel is built with our gravel, to here in France, or bring it to more contemporary, because this was in the 70s, 80s, another gravel pit in Germany, in Wastelands, where we realized that the area will be refilled with earth from excavation, from the building of new buildings in Basel, and then it will become agricultural land. But actually the agricultural land that will serve as agricultural land will be acquired by the municipality and different companies to use it as compensation land for other construction projects. So it's actually double serving construction while taking the earth of the excavation and while giving new possibilities to build as compensation. So it's rather perverse actually. It's like 3 times of exploitation, I would say. If I count, well, not the gravel, the construction, the earth. So it's so actually we have 4 days of excavation here, so we should triplicate that in terms of destruction. So that's very scary. So I was thinking, this question I was telling you before we start talking. Whom takes the decisions in Basel, in land, maybe a case or in general? I know it's super big questions.
Maybe, okay, Basel is very much shaped by this limitation of space, and Basel is growing, and immediately as you grow, you hit the border. Now, if you go 500 meters in this direction, you come to France, or to Germany, or to another canton. And this has a huge impact on how we build, and where do we build. And then, of course, we have the economy. We have Novartis and Roche as gigantic players, and they also own a lot of land. And they develop them. You have the Novartis campus, the Roche campus, And the Novartis campus is a gigantic gated community that is somehow taken out, literally, physically taken out of kind of public space. You can't access it, even though it's gigantic. But also the rules are different. The planning code, the governance of this area is different. So one could almost speak of a certain kind of informality, privatization informality. It doesn't stick to the formal rules that we usually have. Even though it's super corporate, there's a sense of informality, not low level or low income informality, but super high income informality in that, which I find quite interesting. So we have these two gigantic players and some others, a big foundation that owns a lot of land. But we also have, let's say, there was a vote, a referendum, and I hope I'm not kind of misquoting that, but a referendum whether the city is allowed to sell off land, and it was decided not to. So there is a momentum against privatization in the city that is very acute, very aware of that. So it's two forces at the same time. There's a city that owns really a hell of a lot of land and that can control it, what is happening there, and that is doing that very actively, but also 2 or 3 gigantic players who are the city is at the mercy of them. Now, if Novartis would leave, the city would be bankrupt. Everything would vanish here. And that's, it's really a force of, yeah, it's a small city that is monopolized in a way by 2, 3 big players, and they know that they have that power.
Well, I have a question. Oh, yeah.
And you want to explain?
I have a question, but it's not on this.
So many things.
No, I mean, I have a question, but just to say quickly, that's so interesting, because in London, in the UK, like every public body has to sell off all its land now. The NHS has to sell off its land in order to pay for hospitals. Transport for London has to sell off its land in order to pay for infrastructure, so yet more luxury apartments, like on all of this public land. And I keep quoting like Swiss innovations about how we can actually intervene in this process. So, you know, I will definitely add this to my list of, look what they do in Basel. But, you know, I wanted to ask you, Lara, actually, as well. You know, we worked together in 2010 on your project in the Succession Gallery, where, you know, visually, your installation looked not dissimilar to this project. Like there was, you know, there were piles of rubble inside the gallery, but that was quite different because actually those piles were the exact tonnage that had been involved in the construction of that gallery. But I just wondered, you know, I know you've done a few projects like this, which sort of have some visual similarity, and you're looking at, you know, the materials that came from somewhere to go somewhere else, and you know what lies underground. When was your first one?
My first one, well, my first one was not a good one. It was just a list of construction materials of a huge building in Brussels. I've been invited to do something in a building, and I was looking at a way to analyze that building, to understand it, somehow destroy it and criticize it. So measuring all the construction materials was my strategy, to make a list of the materials and present it in the space. But then it looked like a little bit just numbers and a bit abstract, also because I made a mistake to just put it on a paper. And then on my next show in France with a water tower in a little village, I decided to really pile up the materials, but these were materials new. So I've done different projects, sometimes showing the materials you would need to make a building, or sometimes showing the materials you would get if you demolish a building. That's what you get in Vienna. And here the materials of extraction of a quarry. So relating to before the building, after the building, or the production of extraction. It's all about putting construction in pieces to study it and criticize. But there's also about confronting the public with the enormous scale of construction. Because someone would say that I'm a little bit too big. I'm doing things that are rather large for an artist, a bit megalomaniac or something, but if you see what we have around us, you know, there's the high-rise, that, and the parking, and that, it's just peanuts. I mean, I just read in relation with some this nice temporary construction. I mean, the scale of construction and architecture is enormous, it's unhuman, and yeah, that's why I have to be big. Otherwise, I also like to do small things. It's not that I really want to be that big, but this is to be able to have a conversation with these people here, and I need that scale, and that's
But I think it's very much as you said, you know, it's not dressed up in any way to be made palatable. So while clearly it's not, you know, as big as, you know, the whole surround, it's also hard to deal with.
Just since we're talking about architecture and what you maybe could call an architecture, like against architecture, I just remembered a very funny comment an artist friend of mine in Chicago once said, a really brilliant artist, and she's like, I was telling her about a class I had been teaching at ETH, which I've been a postdoc for 5 years in the architecture department there, and she was like, oh yeah, maybe I'd like to talk to you more because I've just always hated architecture. Maybe you can help me start to understand what there is to like about architecture. And I thought it was so funny because, of course, architecture is like the shelter that we live in. It was such a broad statement. But of course, what she was getting at is this kind of inherent violence of architecture, which is that it always imposes something, right? And so to come back to your kind of early description of your response to this brief for the hospital in Senegal, one reason I'd like to come back to it, I really like the way you formulated almost this kind of ethic of architectural practice, which then gets very close to site-specific art. Because you would think that site-specific art is very close to architecture, which should be site-specific, but in fact, very little architecture is site-specific. And so I think this idea of a practice, whether it's art or architecture or activism otherwise, that's tied to context sensitivity and specificity is a really important point. And this kind of work is very slow. It takes a lot of time to kind of really understand and observe a place, to know how to respond in a way that's kind of appropriate, socially, environmentally, like politically, in all sorts of ways. And I think that I'm wrapping up. Yeah, okay. It might often end in a very modest kind of practice, but I talk to my students a lot about, like, how would you think about a form of design where it's not an imposition of something into space, but it's a kind of gesture that amplifies existing conditions or highlights something or makes visible things that are already there that we wouldn't otherwise see. And that's a very, I think, a potential of architecture, but not a often practiced one.
We have 1 minute if you want to answer, or no? Do you want to answer?
Yeah, maybe two things. First of all, I hope not to kind of break the myth, but some of the projects that I'm doing, you might find them deplorable also, because I also want to have the liberty not only to build in eastern Senegal or work with refugees, but I also want to have the liberty to work with super rich clients and build a, I don't know, fancy villa where one person occupies, I don't know, 200 square meters or something. In the end, it's about architecture for me, and an architectural quality that is fascinating. And yes, site-specific, absolutely. It's everything has to be somehow so specific to where it is located, but that doesn't mean that it is kind of regional or genus loci, or that it looks, it can be a very foreign, strange-looking object, but it's still super site-specific. That's what I like to kind of play with.
Great. Now we have very brief time for some questions by the public.
Yes, there is one.
Okay, this is completely something else in relation to what you were talking about that was actually more deep, more interesting, because you have this kind of political and social statement. But just talking about the work and in this context, how do you see this public work? So to whom it belongs now that it's here?
I don't really know what is going to happen with this work in terms of the public. For me, in my projects, I think there is a lot of control and design in the city. So I try to do things that bring the information to the public, that question the city, the space, and then I let people use it in different ways. So for me, I like guides. I know most people hate tourist guides. Me, I love guides because for me, a guide is a tool of information of what happens in the city or places that might be interesting. And then I go whenever I want, if I want, or maybe I don't know, but I know these sites exist. So how this is gonna function if you are gonna take it and go there tonight, I don't think, or tomorrow, or you leave it at home and your kids take it, I don't really know. And I think that's good. I think that's good, but I don't know how the project can produce a knowledge of a place that can produce certain action. That's how I like to leave things loose. So there is some information and some experience of the city, which is, well, you know, there is, people know about the tourists of Basel, but we put quite some information together, not just about the past, but also about the future plans. So there was kind of a heavy research. And then, yeah, a lot of things can happen with these quarries and these spaces and the public. And I'm not aiming to control it.
Perhaps because we need to wrap up to start the following session. I'm sorry that we have to cut this short. But we have, if you all want, we can continue the conversation here informally. And at 3, if people want to do it, please let us know, because if there is no quorum, we will just simply cancel. But if people want to share a little bit more of this conversation with us, Anna has offered to give us an hour of her time to continue this conversation. I just want to say that this is extremely insightful, both your comments, but I also want to finish, and I know we cannot talk about it in the session because the activation of the square has to start, but you are an artist, but you're also a citizen, and you found a way to aesthetically, but also to intervene in the space we live in. No? And I would like us, if you can all share with us, how can we as a citizens make that an impact? No? One was the vote, right? That we do democratically. This vote that was recently occurred here. But also, you know, what are the other formulas that we can take? What are the places we can go? Who are the people we can talk to claim that we have awareness of the use they're doing of something that is part of who we are, where we live, and our rights as well. You know, with that note and that inquiry, I think I have to pass the mic to Isabel Lewis, but I ask you please stay and join us in a conversation. There is juice, there is water, that we're happy to share with everyone. And I hope you also continue the conversation with us tomorrow when at 1 we will have the last of this conversation on Mesoplast, that as you know are part of the Art Basel conversation, one entitled Techno-Tech, moderated by Andrea Lisioni, with Catherine Wood, Claire Tascon, and the Basilea artist Isabel Lewis. So until then, thank you so much, and see you later.